So I've heard some of you tell me that you've never heard of the Maslin method, and you've been trying to research this and you can't find anything about it. Well, I'm here to tell you why. Hi, sweet friends. I'm Mary from marysnest.com and author of the Modern Pioneer Cookbook and the Modern Pioneer Pantry, and I'd like to welcome you to my kitchen. I just wanted to take a minute to clear up some confusion that I have been seeing in comments and receiving in emails. When I started my Maslin Method Baking School series, in which I discussed the Maslin Method and Maslin flour blends, that many of you wrote to me and said, I never heard of the Maslin Method and I can't find anything about it when I go to research. All I find are the 2 videos you've made so far, and maybe you've also seen my 3rd video in the Maslin Method Baking School series, where I make what I call the Modern Pioneer flagship hearth loaf, in which we put the Maslin Method and Maslin flour blends to work and create a wonderful whole grain bread that's both nutritious and delicious. Now, the word Maslin is a real word, and as I explain in my very first video, Maslin refers to a crop that was grown. This is like going back to the Middle Ages, in which farmers would sow rye and wheat together so that if there was a bad season for rye, the wheat would do well, and if there was a bad season for wheat, the rye would do well. If they both did great, that was wonderful. It was really a matter of survival. And then it would all be harvested together, milled together into a flour that was a combination of wheat and rye, and then that would be used, that flour would be used to bake. Now, you may see videos on YouTube that have images of the Middle Ages, and they're talking about Maslin, and they're definitely out there. And so you can clearly educate yourself about Maslin. But the reason why you weren't able to find things that specifically talk to something called the Maslin Method, or Maslin flour blends, or the Maslin Method Baking School, which I'm sharing with you in these series of videos, is because these are terms that I made up. So I made the term the Maslin Method to describe what our ancestors did with their Maslin, but I added the word method at the end because I'm inspired by what they did, but to bring this into the modern kitchen, a traditional foods kitchen like what we all have, but a modern version of it. But what's great about today is that we have such a wide selection of flours that we can buy already milled for us from the grocery store, or we can buy the whole grains and then mill them ourselves at home and create any mixture of flours that we want. And now, why would we want to do that? The reason that we want to do that is something that our ancestors realized but was unintentional. They were simply mixing grains and growing grains together for survival, but they produced really nice breads. So by mixing flours together, we can create those wonderful, nice, hearty breads that our ancestors made. So for example, maybe you're trying to bake with einkorn and spelt, the ancient grains, and they give you some trouble. Well, if you mix in a little wheat, and you can use modern day wheat, you can use hard red wheat, you can use hard white wheat, you can use one of the heritage wheats like Turkey Red and Red Fife, not ancient, but a little older in a sense than the modern day wheats. And what's so nice about this is when you mix these together, the modern day wheat or the heritage wheats bring a little structure to the ancient grains. And baking with ancient grains is very popular and they're very nutritious, but they can be persnickety. But when we start mixing the flours together so that we get this wonderful nutritional diversity, we have the structure from the wheat helping the weaker structures of the ancient grains, like spelt and einkorn and emmer as well. Their gluten is a little different, than the modern day wheats and the heritage wheats. It's even different than the landrace wheats that our ancestors were mixing with their rye. But that wheat helps bring a little structure. And so that's where I coined the phrase Maslin flour blends. Are they just Maslin wheat and rye like our ancestors? No, they're Maslin flour blends for the Maslin method in the Maslin method baking school. So these are, I'm taking poetic license, so to speak, using Maslin to indicate blends. And then we, in our modern kitchens, will be blending lots of different flours together in various mixtures that may be appropriate for certain breads, certain baked goods, usually about 3 at a time. For example, in my hearth loaf, I combined hard white wheat, spelt, and some barley, and it makes a beautiful bread. You could also use hard red wheat, spelt, and barley. You could use hard white wheat, spelt, and oats. You could use hard red wheat and maybe einkorn and maybe oats or barley. You could use wheat, hard red wheat, hard white wheat, one of the heritage wheats, and maybe rye. Now that would be very authentically Maslin. And then maybe you could add in some oats and barley or other grains. So that's what I'm trying to teach, is that by mixing these grains, we can get the benefits of our ancient grains, but with the structure brought into the kitchen of our modern grains. And together they work beautifully. They create nice breads. If you've been frustrated trying to get good structure out of your ancient grains, and if you've been frustrated trying to get your modern day wheats to give you a good rise, I have all kinds of tips and tricks that I'll be sharing with you in the Maslin Method Baking School series to help you become a really good baker of very nutrient-dense, nutritious, whole grain baked goods that actually create something that we like. For example, I'll give you a little tip right now, and I share this in video number 3 where I show you how to make the hearth loaf. And the reason I call that the flagship hearth loaf is because once you learn how to bake that loaf and you get those skills under your belt, everything else is easier. You can become a little bit of a pro at baking with whole grains, including modern day grains and the ancient grains and everything in between. But a little tip, for example, if you add a little acid to the water that you use in baking bread, especially specifically the whole grains, it can help considerably to tamp down tannins that are naturally occurring in bran. Why do so many people often say, I don't like whole wheat bread, I don't like whole wheat this, I don't like whole wheat that, especially when we're talking 100% whole wheat baked goods. It bothers my mouth. What is bothering the person's mouth are the tannins in the bran. When you add a little acid to the water, and many bakers will add a little orange juice, it doesn't give any flavor of orange juice, but that little bit of orange juice added to the bulk of the water that you're using helps tamp down the taste of those tannins. Plus, the acid does something else. Bran is very rough. It has sharp edges. And that's sort of the enemy of gluten, and of gluten being able to form a nice, strong, flexible network to make a nice rise in your bread. So by adding a little bit of acid to your water, it helps soften those sharp edges. So you get 2 benefits. It tamps down the flavor of the tannins, and it helps soften that bran so that you can make a better loaf of bread. So when you hear terms like the Maslin method, or Maslin flour blends, or the Maslin Method Baking School, these are terms that I developed so that I could share with you what I've discovered in my traditional foods kitchen when it comes to baking in very much the way our ancestors did. Because yes, Maslin originally was just wheat and rye, and that is often how in history the term is used. Yes, that's historically correct. But our home bakers and the bakers in town, in the little villages, used often flour blends that were more than just the wheat and rye that had been grown together. A lot depended on where they were in the world. And so, for example, in the British Isles and Ireland, sometimes oats might be mixed in with their flour blends. Sometimes in other parts of Europe, barley was blended in. And sometimes there was a lot of rye and not a lot of wheat, and rye was mixed with barley or other grains, and sometimes there wasn't a lot of rye and wheat was mixed with other grains. But something that home bakers always strived for, in essence, was if the wheat did well, they wanted, and say it was grown, because sometimes the wheat was grown in a narrow strip, and maybe next to it was grown barley. Not all crops were always grown together because they might have different harvest times and so on and so forth. There is a whole wonderful history to all of this, and if you enjoy reading, you will really enjoy some of Elizabeth David's books, where she discusses a lot of history about growing grains and baking of our ancestors. And there's also some very old books, but they can be a little bit of a challenge because they're often written in the Old English. But if they've been updated, they also go into a lot of this history. But what a home baker knew was that the wheat, and these were landrace wheats, and when I use the term landrace wheats, I explain this in a lot of detail in my first video, What is the Maslin Method? In that video, I explain that landrace wheats were simply wheats that farmers grew that had adapted to their particular soil, their particular climate, wherever they were in the world, so on and so forth, and they were simply called landrace wheats. The home baker knew that wheat, including these landrace wheats, just like modern day wheat, that the wheat had good, now she may not have been saying good gluten, but she knew that the wheat always produced a nice loaf of bread. But if she had a good supply or a small supply, she wanted to preserve as much of that wheat flour as possible, stretch it, so to speak, just like we talk today, stretching our food budgets. She wanted to stretch that wheat to last as long as it could. So often in the home kitchen, she might be adding some wheat, and then she'd see what else did she have. Did she have barley? Fine, grind it up with her mortar and pestle or whatever way she was grinding it. Was she close to town? Could she bring it to the miller? And then she would have some barley flour and she would mix that in with her wheat to stretch that wheat so the bread wasn't just made from wheat. And this was a process depending on where people lived in the world. They would always be trying to stretch their wheat and adding other flours that they might have to that wheat in order, as I said, to stretch it and yet make what they found to be a very suitable bread that could feed their family. And they did not necessarily realize that they were creating wonderful nutritional diversity. They just knew they were stretching their wheat. The wheat was working well enough to make a nice sturdy bread with a nice rise, and yet they had stretched it by adding some of these other flours. So that's what we are recreating here in our kitchens, in our traditional foods kitchens, in our modern pioneer kitchens. We are following the wisdom of our ancestors to be able to bake breads that perform beautifully and bring a lot of nutrition to us, And when I say that they perform beautifully, what's nice is, as I said earlier, if you've struggled with spelt, if you've struggled with einkorn, by bringing in that wheat, the way our own ancestors brought in the wheat that they had, we create a nice loaf, a dough that's a little easier to work with, a dough that rises better, a dough that has some structure, yet we're still getting the nutritional benefits that spelt and einkorn bring to the table. Plus, it's no secret, einkorn is expensive, whether you buy the flour already milled or you buy the grain. There's no getting around it. So why not be thrifty like our ancestors and stretch that einkorn? The same with spelt. Spelt is usually, in most cases, a little less expensive than einkorn, but more expensive than some of the wheats that are available to us. So why not stretch that einkorn, stretch that spelt, still get the nutrition from it, still bring that to the table in your home-baked breads, but be in a position where you're relying a little more on the whole wheat that's a little more affordable, and yet stretching is sort of the reverse of what our ancestors did. You're stretching your einkorn, you're stretching your spelt, and you're using the more affordable wheat. But in doing so, you get that wonderful structure that whole wheat brings to baked goods, and yet you're getting all that nutrition that einkorn, like with all the beta carotene, you know, the einkorn flour, it looks yellow. It's very rich in beta carotene, which in our body converts to vitamin A. Vitamin A is so wonderful for our skin and our eyes, especially our eyes. So we're bringing that nutrition, but we're making a bread that's a dough. We're creating a dough that's easier to work with because we've got that wheat there. And not only are we creating a dough that's easier to work with, we're stretching the einkorn, we're stretching the spelt. Maybe you like to bake with emmer, we're stretching the emmer. All of these ancient grains, which are more costly. So we create a more cost-effective bread, a more cost-effective traditional foods kitchen, a more cost-effective modern pioneer kitchen. So I hope this has helped explain any confusion about these terms. That the Maslin method is a term that I made up, Maslin flour blends is a term that I made up, and they both come under the umbrella of what I call the Maslin Method Baking School. And I really hope that you're going to enjoy this series. I think this is bringing us back, if you've seen the first video and then the second video, this is bringing us back to baking, at least in my case, the way my mother baked, and the way my grandmother baked, and the way my great-grandmother baked. This is bringing us back to baking bread that's nutritious, that's an easier dough to work with, that's thrifty, all of the things that I like about baking. No more chasing after those fancy boules with all the holes. I addressed that in video number 2, where I share all those holes. French bakers consider that extremely defective. I find that a little funny. But no more super hot blazing ovens, no more super hot blazing Dutch ovens, no more feeling down in the dumps if your bread doesn't look exactly like something that would be considered Pinterest perfect, or what do they say, Instagram worthy. None of that. That's all behind us. That's all in the past. We're going to, in the past of the late 20th, early 21st century up until now, let's get back to baking good, nutritious, wholesome breads that hold butter, hold jam, can be used to make sandwiches, that aren't already so crisp and crusty that if you do want to toast it, it winds up being burnt. And with those hot ovens, often, okay, maybe you get a nice rise and you got this nice dome, and then you look on the bottom and it's burnt. You know, so we're putting all of that behind us. We're not going to worry about any of that anymore. We're going to learn how to make nutritious bread from whole grains, whether you mill it yourself or you buy the whole grain flour at the store, either or is fine. We're going to hand knead, and so you'll know how to do that, but if you have a stand mixer, you can use that too. And we're not going to worry about, oh, I need a little more water, oh, how much water do I have to weigh the flour? No, none of it. we're going to learn how to bake by look and feel. We're going to have the basic recipes to start with, how much flour, how much water, and then we're going to knead, and we're going to start to learn how our breads look and feel. I've shared in the past, my mother didn't use measuring cups, she didn't use measuring spoons, she used a teacup, one that she drank her tea from, and she used a spoon that she stirred the honey into her tea. And those were her tools. And she just measured stuff out, put some liquid, put her flour, and I use this expression a lot. My mother was a beautiful, refined lady, but in her heart, she was a crunchy granola mama. And she loved finding whole grain flours and baking whole grain breads. And she learned through look and feel how the dough should be before it went into the oven. She never had a scale, and she ate whole grain breads, fed them to us, and I grew up eating whole grain breads. My mother lived to be almost 100, and I'm hoping that I'm almost 70. I hope I'm going to follow in her footsteps. But we're going to bake whole grain breads like our ancestors, using what I call the Maslin method, using flours that I refer to as Maslin flour blends. And we're going to do all this right here in my kitchen, what I call the Maslin Method Baking School. And so I really hope that you'll join me for that. I hope I've cleared up a lot of confusion as to why you've not been able to find these terms on the internet. They're things I developed for us to learn how to become really good whole grain bakers, and at the same time to conserve more expensive grains, rely on modern grains for a little help, and yet create something that is not only nourishing, but that's also tasty, that's also delicious, also the type of bread we want to eat. And we're going to make, as I've shared in, I believe in the first video, here at the Maslin Method Baking School, we're going to make all kinds of baked goods. We're going to make all kinds of breads, and then we're going to move into making a variety of, we're going to make pies, tarts, I love galettes because they're so easy, and I'm going to show you how to do whole grain crusts that really come out nice and really hold up well and yet are flaky. And then we're going to make some fun, like European baked goods, tea time treats that are just going to be luscious, yet made with whole grains. So you don't feel so guilty when you're indulging in them. And then I'm also going to show you how to make a lot of baked goods that are very known here in the United States, and that but we're going to, they're known here, but maybe many have been forgotten over the years. They were baked here, often based maybe on European recipes that women brought with them to the 13 colonies, and then had to kind of jerry-rig them, so to speak, to make use of whatever they had here in the colonies. A lot of corn was used, and they're just a lot of fun to make. They involve a lot of fruits. They all have, many of them have very funny names, and we're going to have a lot of fun making those. And I think those are exceptionally nutritious because they're basically a combination of fruit and whole grains. You can't go wrong with that. And when it comes to sweeteners, I rely on a lot of types of sweeteners that were common to our ancestors, and specifically here to Americans in the early American days. So we're going to use honey, we're going to use maple syrup, we're going to use molasses, so, and even date syrup in some cases. So you're going to become very comfortable at creating baked goods that are really nutritious at their root. And we're going to get away from all the white flour and all the white sugar. And we're not going to be so tied to one way of baking or the other. You want to do sourdough? I'm going to show you how to do whole grain sourdough. You want to do packaged yeast from the grocery store? I'm going to show you how to bake with packaged yeast. As a matter of fact, the first recipe that I showed you in video number 3, we used packaged yeast. And the reason is I want to make this as easy as possible, especially for the new beginner. Those of you who have been with me for a while know that my videos tend to run very long. They're teaching videos, and I like to speak to the beginner. So you can use store-bought flour, you can use packaged yeast, and you can still make a gorgeous bread that I really believe when you bring it to the table, you're going to like it, your friends are going to like it, your family's going to like it, and you're going to really feel that you're opening up a whole new lease in life, so to speak, about how good whole grain breads and whole grain baked goods can taste. And I think it'll be really fun as we go through this year, 2026. I'll definitely, as we get a little closer to July, I'll definitely share one of those early American baked goods with you, especially since here in the US we'll be celebrating our 250th anniversary. So when you celebrate the 4th of July here in the US, you can make a fruit dessert that will harken back, in essence, to the days of the 13 colonies. So that'll be kind of fun. Alrighty, well, I hope this has helped. So just remember the Maslin method, Maslin flour blends, and the Maslin method baking school are terms that I created for us so that we can develop a wonderful relationship, so to speak, with all types of whole grains, whether they're modern day or ancient. And we're going to have a wonderful time in this series, and I'm just looking forward to spending the whole year with you baking a variety of whole grain breads and other baked goods. Alrighty, now, in the interim, be sure to click on this video here where you can watch the playlist for the Maslin Method Baking School, and then keep an eye on that playlist, because every time I make a video that goes into, that's part of the Maslin Method Baking School series, it'll go into that playlist. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.